If you've ever trusted someone with your whole heart, and later realized they were quietly bleeding you dry, this story is going to hit you in the chest. Because the person who betrayed me wasn't a stranger. It wasn't a scammer. It wasn't an enemy. It was my own daughter. The child I carried for 9 months. The girl I stayed up with through fevers and nightmares. The woman I thought would protect me when I got old. And the day I realized she'd taken my pension money and gone on a luxury trip, without even telling me, I felt something inside me crack. But what she didn't know was that by the time she came back home and opened my refrigerator, the real lesson was waiting for her. I spent most of my life believing that if you work hard, keep your head down, and take care of your family, things will somehow balance out in the end. That the sacrifices you make quietly, the things you give up without complaining, will one day come back to you in the form of peace. I didn't grow up with much, so when I finally had a steady job, I treated it like something fragile, something that could disappear if I wasn't careful. I learned to save before I learned to spend. While other people my age were taking trips, buying new clothes, and living for the weekend, I was packing leftovers, working extra shifts, and putting small amounts of money aside, telling myself it was for later, for the version of me who would be tired one day and deserved to rest. Raising a child on your own teaches you a different kind of discipline. You learn how to stretch things that don't want to stretch. You learn how to say no to yourself, so you can say yes to them. There were years when I couldn't remember the last time I bought something just because I wanted it. Every decision passed through the same filter in my mind. Will this help her? Will this keep her safe? Will this give her a better start than I had? I wasn't perfect, but I was present. I showed up when she was sick. I stayed up when she couldn't sleep. I clapped the loudest at school events even when my hands were sore from work. Somewhere along the way, I started to believe that love meant endurance, that being a good mother meant absorbing discomfort, so your child wouldn't have to. When I finally reached the point where I could breathe a little, where the bills didn't scare me the way they used to, I felt proud in a quiet way. Not proud in the loud, look at me sense, but proud in the way you feel when you know you survived something that could have broken you. The small account I'd built over the years wasn't just money to me. It was proof that my life hadn't been random. It was proof that the nights I cried in the car after work, the times I ate standing up in the kitchen, because there was no time to sit, the moments I chose responsibility over comfort, all of that had meaning. So when I realized that the person who had undone it wasn't a stranger, or a system or bad luck, but my own child, the pain didn't come from the number on a bank statement. It came from the story I'd been telling myself for decades, suddenly collapsing. I had believed that the love I poured into her would shape how she treated me. I had believed that my example of patience and restraint would teach her to respect limits. I had believed that sacrifice would be understood, even if it was never spoken out loud. Watching that belief fall apart felt like watching the ground crack under my feet. It's strange how betrayal from family doesn't feel sharp at first. It feels dull, heavy, confusing. You start questioning your own memory, your own judgment, your own role in how things turned out. You replay old moments in your head, looking for signs you missed, moments where you could have done something differently, lines you should have drawn earlier. You wonder if being strong for so long taught the wrong lesson, if always figuring things out quietly made it seem like nothing ever cost you anything. You begin to see how years of doing everything without complaint can make someone believe you don't have limits at all. I realized that what hurt most wasn't just the money disappearing. It was the realization that the story of our relationship had been different in her mind than it was in mine. To me, every sacrifice was a gift given with love. To her, those sacrifices had started to look like a resource she could tap into whenever she wanted. Somewhere between my silence and her assumptions, something had shifted. The effort I made to protect her from struggle had also protected her from understanding what struggle actually costs. And when that understanding is missing, it's easy for entitlement to take root without even being noticed. It's strange how entitlement doesn't arrive all at once, loud and obvious, the way you might expect it to. It grows quietly in small moments that seem harmless at the time. A small favor here, a little exception there, a soft yes when you really meant no. At first, it feels like kindness. It feels like support. You tell yourself that helping someone you love isn't a problem, that being understanding is part of what makes you a good parent. You don't notice the shift, because it happens slowly, almost politely, disguised as need. In the beginning, the requests are reasonable. Can you spot me this once? I'll pay you back next week. Can I use your card, just this one time, mine is acting up. Can you cover this bill? I'm short right now, but I promise I'll handle the next one. Each time, you say yes, because you remember what it felt like to be stuck, to be embarrassed to ask for help, to feel like the ground under you wasn't steady. You don't want to be the person who adds to that weight, especially when the person asking is your own child. You convince yourself that temporary support is part of being a parent, even when your child is grown. But something changes when the support becomes expected instead of appreciated. The thank yous get shorter. The promises to pay you back start to fade. The explanations turn casual, almost careless. You start to hear phrases like, "You're my mom, that's what moms do," as if your role in their life automatically includes unlimited access to your time, your money, and your emotional energy. You might feel a flicker of discomfort in those moments, a quiet voice inside that says this doesn't feel right, but you brush it aside, because confronting it feels harder than carrying it. Over time, the dynamic shifts without either of you naming it. You become the safety net they assume will always be there, no matter how recklessly they move. They don't plan ahead, because they believe you will catch them. They don't manage their resources, because they believe yours are available. Your generosity starts to feel invisible, like air, something necessary, but not something to be acknowledged. The more consistently you fill in the gaps, the less visible the gaps become to the person creating them. There's also a subtle emotional manipulation that can creep in, not always intentional, but powerful all the same. When you hesitate, they remind you of how hard things have been for them. When you set a boundary, they frame it as rejection. When you express concern, they accuse you of not believing in them. Slowly, your desire to avoid conflict starts to shape your decisions more than your own needs. You begin to prioritize their comfort over your own stability, telling yourself that this is temporary, that things will get better once they're back on their feet, even as the timeline keeps stretching. What's hard to admit is that enabling can feel like love when you're inside it. You feel useful. You feel needed. There's a quiet satisfaction in being the person someone turns to in a crisis. But that feeling can become a trap, because being needed is not the same as being respected. When your help becomes the foundation of someone else's lifestyle, instead of a bridge they use to cross a difficult moment, the relationship shifts into something unbalanced. You may start to feel drained, resentful, or invisible, but those feelings often get swallowed because you don't want to appear selfish. The longer this pattern continues, the more distorted the sense of responsibility becomes. The person receiving the help starts to believe that your resources are part of their safety plan. They may not see the late nights you worry about bills, the quiet calculations you make to stretch your budget, the sacrifices you make in your own life to support theirs. From their perspective, things just work out. And when things always work out for someone without visible cost, it's easy for them to assume that it will always be that way. Boundaries feel uncomfortable when you've spent years softening every edge. Saying no can feel like betrayal, even when you know it's necessary. You worry about being seen as cold or uncaring, about damaging the relationship, about pushing them further away. But without boundaries, kindness can slowly turn into a resource that gets extracted rather than a choice that's appreciated. The absence of limits doesn't create closeness, it creates dependency. And dependency, left unchecked, quietly erodes respect until one day you realize that what you thought was support has turned into a pattern where your needs no longer exist in the other person. Technical errors than to believe in personal betrayal, especially when the person involved is someone you love. I tried again, slower this time, pressing each button carefully, as if precision alone could fix what I was starting to feel in my chest. When the same message appeared, the unease grew heavier, but I still hadn't named it. Denial has a way of softening the edges of reality until you're ready to look at it directly. Walking into the bank felt like stepping into a space that suddenly didn't belong to me anymore. The familiar counters, the polite smiles, the quiet hum of routine all felt distant, as if I were watching someone else's life unfold. When the teller spoke, her voice was calm, professional, almost gentle, but the words landed with a weight I wasn't prepared for. Numbers turned into meaning in an instant. What had been security became vulnerability. What had been a cushion became a cliff edge. It wasn't just about money disappearing. It was about the sudden awareness that something stable in my life had been touched without my consent. On the walk home, the world looked the same, but it didn't feel the same. Cars passed. People talked. The sky didn't change color. Yet everything felt slightly out of place, like a familiar room after the furniture has been rearranged. I replayed recent days in my mind, searching for clues, for small moments that might explain what had happened. I noticed how easily my thoughts avoided the most obvious possibility, as if my mind were protecting me from something it wasn't ready to accept. When you trust someone deeply, the idea that they could harm you doesn't just hurt, it destabilizes the story you've been telling yourself about who they are and who you are to them. The conversation that followed didn't unfold the way I had imagined betrayal would feel. There was no dramatic confession, no visible shame, no hesitation. The casualness of it was what made the moment sink in. Hearing the truth spoken, without remorse, created a strange stillness inside me. Anger didn't rise the way I expected it to. Tears didn't come right away. Instead, there was a quiet clarity, a realization that the person standing in front of me was not the version of them I had been holding onto in my mind. The distance between expectation and reality became impossible to ignore. In that stillness, something shifted. I stopped arguing with what had happened and started seeing it for what it was. The loss wasn't just financial. It was emotional. It was the loss of an assumption I had carried for years, the assumption that love automatically includes consideration, that family automatically means safety. When that assumption fell away, it took with it a certain innocence I hadn't realized I was still carrying. There was grief in that realization, not just for the money, but for the version of the relationship I had believed in. That moment didn't turn me into someone hard overnight. It didn't erase love or replace it with bitterness. What it did was draw a line inside me between what I could excuse and what I could no longer ignore. It was the point where confusion gave way to clarity, where hurt stopped being something I explained away and became something I acknowledged. The emotional breaking point wasn't loud, but it was firm. It was the moment I understood that continuing to pretend everything was fine would cost me more than I was willing to lose. There's a certain kind of power in choosing calm when everything inside you wants to explode. It feels unnatural at first, almost like you're betraying your own feelings by not letting them spill out. For a long time, I thought standing up for myself meant raising my voice, listing every hurt, making sure the other person felt the full weight of what they'd done. But in that moment, I realized that noise would only give her something to push against. Anger invites argument. Tears invite dismissal. Silence, when chosen deliberately, creates space for clarity. Calm isn't the absence of emotion. It's emotion that's been given direction. Instead of pouring energy into confrontation, I started pouring it into control over the things I actually had the power to change. There was something grounding about making small, practical decisions in the middle of emotional chaos. Each phone call I made, each password I changed, each account I secured felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that had been handed over too easily. These weren't dramatic acts. No one applauded them. But they quietly shifted the balance back into my hands. It's easy to underestimate the impact of simple boundaries, because they don't look like revenge in the way stories often frame it. There's no grand reveal, no public humiliation, no moment of watching someone else fall apart. There's just a steady withdrawal of access. The doors that were once open out of habit begin to close out of intention. The resources that were once shared out of guilt begin to be protected out of respect for yourself. This kind of response doesn't satisfy the urge for immediate emotional release, but it creates something more lasting, a foundation you can stand on instead of constantly bracing for the next blow. Choosing quiet consequences over loud confrontation also changes the dynamic of responsibility. When you don't argue about the harm, you don't get pulled into defending your feelings or proving your pain. You let the reality of the situation speak for itself. This can feel uncomfortable at first, because it removes the familiar pattern of emotional exchange. There's no back and forth to hide behind. The focus shifts from what was said to what will now change. In that shift, accountability becomes unavoidable. The other person can dismiss your emotions, but they can't easily dismiss the closed door, the cancelled access, the new limits that are calmly held in place. There's also something deeply stabilizing about acting in alignment with your values rather than reacting to someone else's behavior. Revenge doesn't have to mean becoming harsh or cruel. It can mean refusing to participate in a dynamic that harms you. It can mean choosing self-respect over the temporary satisfaction of making someone else feel small. In doing so, you protect your own sense of integrity. You don't have to look back later and wonder if you crossed lines you never wanted to cross. The boundary becomes the message. As the days passed, I noticed a subtle shift in how I felt inside. The constant tightness in my chest began to ease. The sense of being on edge, waiting for the next request, the next crisis, the next emotional demand, slowly faded. In its place was a quiet steadiness. I was no longer bracing myself. I was standing in my own space, aware of where I ended and where someone else began. That awareness brought with it a kind of peace I hadn't felt in years. There's a misconception that being firm means being cold. In reality, firmness can coexist with care. You can still love someone while refusing to enable behavior that hurts you. You can hold compassion for their struggles without making those struggles your responsibility to fix. This balance takes practice. It requires sitting with discomfort, with the fear of being misunderstood, with the possibility of disappointing someone you care about. But over time, the discomfort of holding a boundary becomes easier than the pain of having none. Quiet consequences don't seek to punish. They seek to restore balance. They shift the focus away from emotional drama and toward practical reality. In doing so, they allow you to step out of the cycle of reaction and into a place of intentional action. That shift may not look dramatic from the outside, but internally, it can feel like stepping back into your own life after standing too long in someone else's shadow. Respect doesn't arrive in grand gestures or sudden declarations. It grows in the spaces where expectations are made clear and consequences are consistent. For a long time, I believed that love alone would teach someone how to treat me. I believed that patience would eventually be recognized, that giving without keeping score would inspire gratitude. But what I learned is that without limits, generosity can quietly lose its meaning. When help is always available, it stops being seen as help and starts being seen as a guarantee. When comfort is constant, it can dull awareness of where that comfort comes from. If someone never has to feel the weight of their choices, they never develop a reason to change them. The absence of consequences doesn't create freedom, it creates a kind of emotional numbness where responsibility fades into the background. It becomes easy to move through life assuming that someone else will absorb the impact of your decisions. In that environment, respect has very little room to grow because there's no need for it. The moment comfort is interrupted, something shifts. It's not always immediate, and it's rarely graceful, but it introduces friction into a pattern that had been running on autopilot. Friction forces awareness. When access to resources, time, or emotional support is no longer unlimited, the reality of dependence becomes visible. The person who had been coasting begins to feel the edges of their own choices. That feeling can show up as anger, defensiveness, or denial at first, because change often feels like loss before it feels like growth. What's difficult is resisting the urge to soften the moment. When that discomfort appears, watching someone struggle, especially someone you love, can trigger old habits of rescuing and smoothing things over. It can feel cruel to let them sit with the consequences of their actions. But allowing someone to experience the results of their choices is not the same as abandoning them. It's an invitation to step into their own agency. It's a chance for them to see themselves as capable of handling discomfort rather than someone who must always be shielded from it. Respect grows when accountability becomes part of the relationship. When expectations are spoken and followed through on, the dynamic shifts from one-sided caretaking to mutual recognition. The person who once took support for granted begins to see it as something that can be lost if it's not valued. This doesn't mean relationships become transactional or cold. It means they become grounded in reality rather than assumptions. Care continues, but it's paired with clarity. Support remains, but it's offered with boundaries that protect both people involved. There's also a change that happens internally when you stop enabling. You begin to see yourself differently. Instead of measuring your worth by how much you can give or how much you can absorb, you start to recognize your own needs as valid. This shift can feel unsettling at first, especially if your identity has been tied to being the dependable one, the fixer, the person who always shows up no matter the cost. Letting go of that role can feel like losing a part of yourself, but what you gain in return is a more balanced sense of who you are and what you deserve. Over time, when comfort is no longer guaranteed, effort begins to appear. The person who once relied on your safety net starts to make small adjustments, small attempts to stand on their own. These efforts may be uneven at first, filled with missteps and resistance, but they represent movement. Respect grows in these moments of movement, because respect is tied to recognizing effort, recognizing limits, and recognizing the humanity of the other person as someone separate from yourself. True change rarely comes from being lectured or shamed into it. It comes from experiencing the natural outcome of choices in a space where those outcomes are allowed to exist. When you step back from constant rescuing, you create room for that experience to happen. In that space, respect has a chance to form, not as fear of losing support, but as understanding of its value.